Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's episode is Season 4, Episode 19, or Episode 79 overall, The Pink Purloiner and Squidward, both of which originally premiered on Nickelodeon throughout 2007, early to mid-2007. They were spread out quite a bit, one in February, one in July. As is the case for all of these later Season 4 episodes except for one, they did release on DVD earlier in the year, but still, figure the air dates are important because that was a lot of people's first exposure to these episodes. And so, kicking off the penultimate episode pairing, The Pink Purloiner originally aired on February 19th, 2007, written by Luke Brookshire, Tom King, and Stephen Banks. Though oddly enough, on Season 4, Volume 2, it's listed as 79B. It is put after Squidward on that thing. This isn't the first time this has happened. Squid on strike and Sandy, SpongeBob, and the Worm switched around a little bit on their DVD. I think it's happened a few times before, but it doesn't really impact the packaging order beyond that. I think they've, restored that or reinstated or flat out instated, because this might have even been before their packaging order was decided. Pink Purloiner goes first all the time now, and I kind of appreciate that because this is a good episode to lead in on. It was the last episode to enter production during Season 4. We've got one coming up that started in Season 5 but was brought forward to air in Season 4. It's kind of odd that SpongeBob was allowed to do that, but it was apparently an important episode, but, them's the rules. Pink Purloiner is an interesting episode because of how uninteresting it is. It's just a good old reliable SpongeBob episode. You see how I snuck in the name of Old Reliable in there? This isn't the first appearance of Old Reliable. It had appeared in Nature Pants back in Season 1, but it had a different design back there. It more or less looked like a typical jellyfishing net, whereas here they gave it a more sturdy, rubberized look. And I do have to respect how SpongeBob opening All Reliable's casing has caught on as a meme. The shot of him opening it up and whatever's in that case, it's All Reliable for whatever the memer wants. The jellyfish migration is also a good way to identify this episode. If you haven't seen it in forever, you can always say, oh, it's the one with the jellyfish migration, because that gave the designers a lot of new potential for new jellyfish designs, and they're mostly kept to the start, but I do appreciate how we've got more jellyfish to gawk at in the background there than just the classic pink ones. You see those pink ones back there, but also the orange ones, the blue ones, the yellow ones. This definitely isn't the first SpongeBob media ever to do different colored jellyfish, but I just thought I'd point that out because it gives certain scenes in this episode a neat rainbow effect. And something I do like about this episode going forward as much as it goes backward is that they whip up the old Blue Danube track for the scene at the start of SpongeBob and Patrick jellyfishing, which is a subtle callback to their, waltz with it in the first episode all about jellyfishing. Not the first jellyfishing ever in the show, but first episode all about jellyfishing and what it means to them. So these writers definitely did their research and were paying tribute to elements of the early seasons, bringing them, into this new era. Oh, and that's quite an interesting red herring from an animation standpoint. Patrick playing with the wooden net, and SpongeBob thinks that it's All Reliable, because this is unfortunately an era jam-packed with animation errors. Like, sometimes, SpongeBob's, the side of his face, it'll be the wrong color, or his paws. In just this episode, but in many others, maybe for a shot or a single frame, the eyes will be the wrong color on a character, or, SpongeBob will walk into his door. That's a funny thing to look forward to at the start of this episode. But what I'm saying about animation errors is that they were plentiful because they were just making so many episodes and couldn't really do retakes as often. And, it does seem like some of these would be quick fixes in the editing bay. I mean, we're in the digital era now, guys. But somehow they made the twist reveal with the net a little better here, because now I have no idea if they were putting these errors in intentionally to catch me off guard. Probably not. There's a 1% chance of that. But it is interesting to know that, they made a slight, decision with the way the net looks. And that is something that eagle-eyed viewers will catch onto. But, eagle eyes are probably not what they want for a lot of other scenes. So it's interesting. It's very interesting. Overall, this episode is just pretty, pretty standard SpongeBob and Patrick tiff at this point in the show. It isn't too oppressive at this point, too nasty towards SpongeBob, because there are times later on where, it can hardly seem like Patrick's a good friend for him, but at this point, season 4, there still is some playful charm to it, and a lot of final loony gags here. It kind of reminds me of Bummer Vacation in a way, in that they start with a down-to-earth sort of story, but sort of fill it with these gags in the middle to, get the plot going, give you something to laugh at. And you can argue that this makes these sorts of episodes a bit more two-dimensional, but I don't really have any problem with SpongeBob being funny as long as the ending, goes back to what the story means. But going back to what I meant to say about animation errors that are that small and just about noticeable is that the show in 2006, 2007 was still being made for 4x3, 480p TV displays. And if you pop this in an old DVD player hooked up to a CRT, you can notice it if you're paying attention, but yeah, that is a different look than how we watch it now. But still, I just wanted to point that out, the difference in, how much clarity we've got in the picture at this point. Of the many gags in this episode, one of the ones that doesn't punch the most for me is Mr. Krabs appearing and then disappearing for the gag of the money reward. It's alright, having Mr. Krabs pop up for a money joke, it works, but at the same time, I do sort of wonder if that was supposed to be a B-plot that went somewhere when really it might have just been a one and done for him. But on the other hand, you've got Confessor Bear in this episode, which is a just absolutely classic scene. I do really like how they have SpongeBob, playing with toys technically, but it does sort of depict itself very childishly, but at the same time it is very funny how they sort of twist this innocent stuffed animal into this hardcore investigator. And honestly, the debate of whether SpongeBob playing with, stuffed animals is too childish, I mean, you can go round and round in circles with that because he's been weightlifting with stuffed animals since the pilot. Other cool things about this episode are Patrick growing an arm out of his chest. That's a fun scene to look forward to. Not just for the absurdity of it, but also for the continuity of it, because Patrick, although not as, metamorphic as SpongeBob, he does have his moments, I think starfish can, grow appendages like that. I could be completely wrong on that. But yeah, starfish are definitely strange creatures, and sometimes they do that with Patrick, not just the elaborate joke that starfish don't have brains in the way that we know them. And this all leads up to this very sappy ending of SpongeBob and Patrick. Their friendship is on the line. And they've done this before in stuff like The Secret Box, Rockabye Bivalve, Patrick Smartpants. This isn't new at all, and that is what I think is quite appealing about this episode. How they just, at the last minute, acknowledge that they've been doing this for years, and, somehow SpongeBob and Patrick are still learning things from this, but this bus driver here, this very savvy character, knows what's up, and the scene borders on self-parody because of the bus driver, but at the same time, even though this is only about 4 seasons into the show, people had known these characters for about 8 years by the time this episode aired, so, it's for the people who have known these characters so long that they know this is how the story is going to end. You've got someone on the show acknowledging this. And I think that's just a funny way to end the episode. But it also sort of feels like the staff saying, we gotta try something new next season. We gotta, push at the boundaries. And it's gonna make for some interesting SpongeComs next season. But here we go. Squid, which originally aired on July 24th, 2007 and was written by Casey Alexander, Chris Mitchell, and Danny McKelly. This is my least favorite episode of season 4, and there honestly isn't too much competition for that title. I already really dislike All That Glitters, but Squidward also, it's got some of the same, characterization and pacing funkiness, but it's just boring. This is a really boring episode. This was the last one that Nickelodeon bothered airing from season 4. It aired during a fortnight of otherwise season 5 premieres, but I wouldn't say TV watchers were missing out on much if they didn't have the DVDs yet. I've been talking and gulping about a minute into this episode, and there really isn't much to say at this point. It's more of just SpongeBob messing with Squidward unintentionally. But at least they do show a few transformations for SpongeBob, like turning into a flower, turning into a piece of parchment for paint. And he turns into a drill a little later, so they are definitely playing up that SpongeBob can be anything just to bother Squidward, and that sort of feels like what they're going for to make this one stand out, but there just really isn't much that separates this scene from, other scenes we've had up to this point of SpongeBob bothering Squidward around his house. Like, you could interchange this with a lot of scenes like this from season 6, 7, 8, 9A maybe, and there really wouldn't be too much of a difference. I guess all the names that SpongeBob lists, some of them are, funny little sea puns, mahjong. That sounds pretty interesting. What kind of sea life is that based on? I like the little squeak they give SpongeBob there. I've heard it in other shows, but it just kind of sticks out when it's in SpongeBob. I don't know why. In a couple seconds, we're going to get to the crux of this episode, if you're watching along with us. And that is, SpongeBob constructs his own little mini squid. This little marionette, this puppet that he can play with when Squidward doesn't want to play with him, which is basically never. So SpongeBob is basically making himself a new friend. And, like I said in the last segment, it is debatable whether SpongeBob playing with toys is, makes him too kiddie of a character, but I really don't mind this on paper. As a matter of fact, we have seen a Squidward puppet before. It looks kind of similar to the one from the paper. They do a little gag there of Squidward, trying to get a puppet out to show that the paper isn't that interesting of a toy, but then, SpongeBob gets some stand up out of it. Classic bit. That 10 seconds gets more out of me than, this whole 11-minute episode. Not to say it's completely devoid of humor or interesting things, but it is almost. The Squidward puppet is a little different. It's got shorter limbs. I would say they got the look of a little puppet down pretty well. And also, what else is there to talk about? We've got about 6-7 minutes left of this episode, and a good chunk of it is going to just be at the Krusty Krab. Basically, let me just tell you the whole plot of the Krusty Krab thing. So if you haven't seen this episode yet, you don't have to. Basically, Mini Squid impresses the Crustomers more than Squidward ever has. He becomes their new best friend. They dance around, and they hate Squidward even more for trying to, butter up to them after Mini Squid ends up winning their respect. Would you look at that, a puppet with respect? You can tell it's going to be hard for me to talk about this whole thing for the rest of SpongeComs, but there are a few things that I noticed, There is a bit coming up here where Incidental 7 grabs a $300 bill from her cleavage. I'm surprised that got past the censors, but I am not going to ask why that's in there. It's one of the only interesting things that happens around here. Squidward briefly gets demoted to busboy. It's only for that one bit of Mr. Krabs becoming a bit more enamored with Mini Squid, but otherwise, not much happens. A good two or so minutes of this is the Thieving Magpie overture dance, and thank goodness for Encyclopedia SpongeBobia for, giving me the information that it was the Thieving Magpie overture, because otherwise I wouldn't really care. I mean, there are a few, memorable bits and bobs of that little sequence, but I will never associate them with this episode. And if I make it to Season 7 of SpongeComs, I believe that this is what a lot of them are going to sound like. Just me rambling into a microphone about how bored I am with the episode and what's happening in it. Oh, there's the literal money shot of this episode. I will say it is kind of, we have seen Squidward dance in the Krusty Krab before, with Culture Shock. So I think this is, calling way back to that. But also, you could have done more jokes with it than just, booty shaking. And also, oh, here's the dance-off coming right up. Oh yeah, here's the thing. I just don't like how Mini Squid looks in that sort of... What would you call that? A one piece with a sweatband? It's kind of, makes it even, more dry. And I guess maybe this was all supposed to be a learning experience for Squidward. That he should have been this sort of fascinating thing for the Crustomers to find joy and relatability in, much like SpongeBob has sometimes, and this Mini Squid has, way better. Speaking of way better, there's an episode from season 11 I would recommend over this called Chef Bob, where, SpongeBob, because he's camera shy around working in public, they've got a new public catering bar at the Krusty Krab. He makes a little puppet of himself out of a plastic bag, and then they get a plot out of that. They actually get a plot out of that, of the puppet, becoming nastier and becoming the villain of the piece, and, I get some laughs out of that. It has a plot. It goes somewhere. Whereas this episode just sort of gets its yucks out of whatever it can and then just stops. Squidward, Mini Squid just joins either a clarinet or, oh yeah, it is a clarinet playing company, and just leaves Squidward to be annoyed by SpongeBob and his Mini Sponge, which doesn't even really make sense in the context of the episode. The reason Mini Squid was made is so SpongeBob wouldn't have to bother Squidward. That was the one and only thing that Squidward liked about it until SpongeBob took that away from him. But then, what is the point of SpongeBob making a mini sponge other than just a lame gag at the end? And this whole thing of Squidward breaking down and getting into a fight with the mini squid, it's totally one-sided. Mini Squid hasn't shown anything other than just being a puppet. And perhaps Squidward's, rage, stress, could have had a bigger part in this episode, make it a big old Ren Hoek-esque mental breakdown, but then it's very sudden and then stops when this Milo J. Finkerfish comes into play. They've done those sorts of Ren Hoek-esque breakdowns before and stuff like Squeaky Boots. It can work, and they do it a bit later to varying degrees of success. This episode and everything it does, it just feels very half-hearted. Although one thing I do like is this possible meta joke at the end with Mini Squid sharing the same voice between SpongeBob and Milo J. Finkerfish, because, Milo, from the sounds of it, is voiced by Tom Kenny, just like SpongeBob. So, you could look at that as either Mini Squid sharing the same voice between them, or Mini Squid was somehow alive this entire time, and this is, their way of, shocking the viewer. But other than that, not much to laugh at in this episode. The only other thing I had in my notes was 12 Angry Jellyfish being, named after 12 Angry Men. But, in this later season 4 period, I think I'm just getting a bit exhausted of the movie references. It feels like there's been one in every episode or every other episode. And in moderation, they're fine, and I think they can be funny and, give me something to talk about, but this is like the 5th in a row that, has forced me to name an old movie, and that's a weak note to end on. That was The Pink Purloiner and Squidward. Last week, I asked you what your favorite Krabs and Plankton team-up was, and a lot of you gave the same kind of answers because they've done those episodes very sporadically, but they do it as often as they need to, whenever they have a good idea for it, and here are some cases where they thought they had a great idea for it. Dashiell says the Krusty Bucket. It's a season 12 episode with, the Krabs and Plankton weird clone with the good handshakes. I remember really liking that one. Random Lad says either best frenemies or friend or foe. Brendan Barney also says friend or foe. So does Seiji M. Hadsock. Pepe Le Pew says friend or foe and the other Patty. Bryce Form says friend or foe and best frenemies. Sparkling with Knights says friend or foe, the Krusty Bucket, and there will be grease. That's a season 13 episode. I saw that one a while ago, and I really want to get around to reviewing season 13 already, but this is taking up a bit of time. Spongio Takoof says Want to Be Wild is good, but Best Frenemies is the best. Best Frenemies is also the best for the question. And Foxboy says the Krusty Bucket. Honorable mentions will be There Will Be Grease and Friend or Foe. Okay, so my question time for you this week, this penultimate week in SpongeComs Season 4 is, what or who is your favourite jellyfish? Because you don't think of jellyfish as being characters, but there have been a few, like Friend/No Name, and 12E, he's a classic. But my personal vote will be Big Lenny. I mean, that is quite the foreboding painting they have of him, and I just like the name Lenny. But next week, for the end of SpongeComm Season 4, we have sticky gloves and sticky gum and some sticky situations in Best Day Ever and The Gift of Gum. Goodbye for now.